Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Romans. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. Also keep in mind that these Daily Word, verse by verse studies are uploaded to my YouTube channel, BP The Bible Perspective. That's BP The Bible Perspective. So subscribe and like to the channel. Like and share these videos. All right, so, excuse me. We are in chapter 3, Galatians chapter 3, and we are in verse 10. I wanted to go back to this verse because what we are explaining is what the law is. Now, this is important because verse 6, he says, just as Abraham believed God, it was credited to him for righteousness. He says, so then those who have faith are blessed with Abraham who had faith. Why is that important? Because he says, for all, verse 10 again, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. And this is what I'm saying. People do not realize that when you put your confine yourself, your walk, when you put yourself under the law, whether you understand that you're doing it or not. He says you're putting yourself under a curse. Now he's going to explain why in a minute. Let me go back briefly and say, why is that important to understand? What is the law? So we said that God gave Moses the law. If you, like me, you saw the movie, The Ten Commandments. There have been several movies in Hollywood, poorly done, but movies that depict the Genesis account and then the Exodus account of Israel going down into Egypt and then being delivered from Egypt. And then, of course, the famous scene where Moses received the Ten Commandments. Well, God gave the nation of Israel, which he started through Abraham. And all this comes important to understand here. Abraham being the father of the nation of Israel. We go back to Genesis. And so I'm skipping ahead here, but it's going to play out in this letter. 400 years before, almost 430, probably a little more, almost 500 years before the law was given, before Moses came, God appeared to Abraham, made a promise to him that he was going to give, that through his barren wife, Abraham and Sarah, his wife Sarah was barren, through his barren wife Sarah, she was going to have a son. That was a promise made. And he said that through that son, the entire family of all the people of the earth would be blessed. But in the meantime, what you find is from the seed of that son, a nation was born. God raised up an entire nation. So now 500 years later, he gives that nation of people, the descendants of Abraham, his law. This law was to govern them. The laws of worship. There's also laws that would make you righteous before God. The problem is that what Paul is saying here, the law was never intended to make you righteous before God. It has been ingrained in our mind. It starts off when you say the Ten Commandments, the law of the Ten Commandments. The greater expanse of the law, the 5 books of Moses, which comes out to 600 plus commandments. But they are all simply explanations or applications of the Ten Commandments. So you can say that the 10 Commandments are broken down into those 600 plus commandments, but the 10 Commandments are broken really down into 2 commandments. Love God, love your neighbor. And so when you look at all of the commandments, they're really based upon those 2 commandments. The problem is that now God also said, if you don't do these things, you're cursed. And then he spells out in the law what the blessings are and the cursed. By the way, he spends more time, especially in the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy, talking about what the curse is than he does the blessing. Okay? Now again, it's important in terms of why then if you are saying in yourself that I want to do the law. Now, sometimes in our pride, our religious pride, we want to say, I'm going to do the law. But what that means is I want to do certain aspects of the law. That I want to do certain points. I don't want to do, I can't do all of the law, and I come to realize that. But it's certainly easy for me to compartmentalize and say, oh, I do these, but what about this over here? So I want to read something from James, because along with what Paul is saying right here, if I'm going to do the law, he says, verse 10 again, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, because it is written, everyone who does not continue doing everything written in the book of the law is cursed. That's important to understand, because this is where we forget. Let me read this in James again, the book of James, which is interesting because James is, as we know, the Lord's brother. And he was known to be a righteous person. He was the leader of the Jerusalem church. He became a believer in Jesus Christ, but he was the leader in the Jerusalem church. So in verse 8, this is the letter of James, and in chapter 2, verse 8 says, if you really carry out the royal law prescribed in scriptures, love your neighbors as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show favoritism, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the entire law, yet fails in one point, is guilty of breaking it all. For he who says, do not commit adultery, also says, do not murder. So if you do not commit adultery, but you murder, you are a lawbreaker. So what is this point? What is Paul saying here? If you say, I'm going to now try to be righteous before God by keeping the law, by living right, you have to understand that God's standard is perfection, which you cannot do. You cannot complete. So there is a statute in the law that says that if you see your brother's ox lost, he says, go and take the ox, keep it until your neighbor comes looking for the ox, and then give it back to him. And the reason why I'm saying that is because that's minor. Suppose I ignore it, right? And the ox goes off, falls in the ditch, dies, or whatever. But before God, guess what? I violated his law because he told me to do that. And since he told me to do that minor thing, and I didn't do that minor thing, I violated, guess what? I am just as guilty. I failed the law as if someone who murdered failed the law. Now remember, we're dealing with God's perfection. And also remember, you may say, well, that's not fair. Keep in mind, he gave you a way out, fool, right? This is why faith is so important. Because you cannot keep up even with the minor things. These little things. That's why he says right here, if you don't continue doing everything, you have to do everything in the book of the law perfectly all the time. So if you failed in one aspect, you're guilty of it. So you in your human frailty could never achieve a right standing with God in your flesh because you're incapable of doing it. You know, think about people saying, well, dying of unconfessed sins. Well, the very little thing, your stinking attitude, remember, stinks before God. Which means you fail the law with your attitude. I mean, remember there's 600 plus commandments. We can't go through all of them, but that's the least of it. And the law covers all of it. The little bitty ones and the big ones. Down to the fact of your attitude. How you speak, how you treat one another. If you're unkind to one another, you fail the law. See, now we always think, well, I don't commit adultery. I'm not a serial killer. But you was unkind to someone. You failed the law, just like that person who was the murderer. So, that's why it says, faith becomes the answer. Faith is our golden parachute. Take it. All right, I'm going to pick it up at verse 11 in the next video. I will see you then.